How is this a foul on Sophie Cunningham? Yo, am I seeing things?
I think that's just a common foul. Nia Coffey is just trying to bring.
How is Sophie Cunningham fouling somebody's elbow with her face? The same thing that happened with Caitlin Clark and Alyssa Thomas. What am I watching right now?
This is the camera angle they don't show you, where Sophie Cunningham actually fouls her twice. Once with the hands, and then secondly with her body. And Coffey went for a rip through, and Sophie's face was in her space, so she got hit with an elbow.
Right there. Let's see. Okay, yeah, there's the defensive foul. With the hands on Coffey right away. Okay.
How about a WNBA refs? This is just a defensive foul. Thank you for the review. Just a defensive foul. No hostile act. Just a foul on Sophie Cunningham. They call that a foul on Sophie Cunningham. She's got 14 of her teeth on the ground. That's a defensive foul. And they reviewed it for a hostile act. Yeah, Sophie's saying, hey, I just got my jaw broke. Is this a political stance? You just took 14 of my teeth. Yeah, quiet, Sophie, no big deal. A defensive foul. Let's watch this one more time. This is on Sophie? No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Elbow to the jaw to 14 teeth gone. That's offensive, bruh. Yeah, Sophie, you got your face knocked in. We see it.
We need to have a very serious and very direct conversation about two separate but deeply interconnected situations that emerged from the Indiana Fever versus Minnesota Lynx game, because both of them deserve honest examination and neither of them is receiving the institutional response the evidence demands. The first situation involves Sophie Cunningham and what is now an undeniable and documented pattern of officiating decisions that appear to be specifically and consistently working against her. The second involves multiple physical plays from that same game that were either called incorrectly, not called at all, or reviewed with full replay access and still called incorrectly, which reflects the exact same officiating accountability problem that has surrounded Indiana players throughout this entire season in ways that have already generated congressional attention, NBA commissioner public intervention, and sustained international media coverage. Let us start with Sophie Cunningham, because the footage circulating from this game is genuinely and completely indefensible from an officiating standpoint, and the institutional response to it has been inadequate. Cunningham was elbowed in the face during the Minnesota game. That is the factual and documented reality of what occurred. The contact was visible. The trajectory of the elbow and the precise location where it connected with Cunningham's face are not ambiguous when the footage is examined with any degree of honest attention.
I know you don't have the Fever again in the regular season, but coming out of the break, one of the big news stories has been Sophie Cunningham and the protests for her and protests against her. And, you know, they had a national televised game today and Cheryl, you know, wore a shirt, and it's just a conversation. I'm wondering, just what do you think about it? Do you think that's good for the league? Does it detract from the basketball? Is it just noise? I'm just wondering what your opinion is.
I think, thank you for that question. I think just in terms of how I'm seeing it is, if I could answer with, like, for me, sports is about belonging. It's about inclusivity. It's about allowing everyone to be their authentic self. You know, I'm big on that just because I have been criticized for my height, for my ethnicity. I've been in those "you shouldn't belong here" many times. And for me, I don't want that space, especially Golden State, to ever feel like that. So I'm all about women, little girls deserving to play, and that includes trans women. So I'm all about inclusivity.
What happened next is the part that has the broader sports media world and the basketball community shaking their heads in collective disbelief. The officials called a defensive foul on Sophie Cunningham.
It's a defensive foul. No hostile act occurred. There was no secondary act after the defensive foul. Play resumes with Minnesota ball on the sideline.
Oh, you didn't realize they called that on Sophie Cunningham?
Oh, okay.
So
I think it should be an offensive foul. I don't think it should be a defensive foul.
And here's the thing. Now, when they go and look at that,
Let that land completely before moving anywhere else. An offensive player's elbow made contact with Sophie Cunningham's face. The officials then reviewed the play with full replay access available to them. After examining footage that clearly documented what occurred, they maintained the ruling that the foul belonged to Cunningham rather than to the player whose elbow connected with her jaw. The logical framework being applied here defies the basic principles of how basketball fouls are supposed to function at any level of the sport. If an offensive player's elbow contacts a defender's face and the result is a foul on the defender, then by that exact same standard, every time any player is called for an elbow violation, it should be ruled a defensive foul on the player whose face was in the path of the elbow. The reasoning collapses immediately when applied with consistency across comparable situations, which means it is not being applied with consistency, which means something other than consistent standards is operating in the officiating decisions being made in and around Indiana Fever games involving Sophie Cunningham. Prominent voices in the sports media world outside the typical WNBA commentary space noticed this specific call, and the reaction was swift and pointed. The framing that resonated most directly was the observation that Cunningham received a foul for having her jaw in the path of a moving elbow. The absurdity of that construct being the officiating outcome from a play that was reviewed with full replay access reflects a standard of officiating accountability that falls well below what any professional sports league should be comfortable defending publicly in front of an audience that is now as large and as engaged as the WNBA's current audience is. The most concerning dimension of this specific situation is what appears to be developing as a pattern rather than an isolated incident. The footage emerging from recent games involving Cunningham shows a player who is being called for fouls in situations where the contact clearly originated from an opponent rather than from her defensive positioning. That pattern, if it continues without institutional correction, is going to have real consequences for how Cunningham can play, how physically active she can be as a defender, and how much floor time she can occupy without accumulating foul trouble that removes her from games where Indiana needs her most. The concern being expressed by observers tracking this carefully is that the officiating treatment Cunningham is receiving may be connected to the public positions she has taken throughout this season, the cultural conversation she has been willing to engage with openly and directly, and the stances she has taken that have generated controversy within certain institutional corners of this league's culture. When a player takes visible public positions on culturally charged topics and then finds herself on the receiving end of a series of officiating calls that do not withstand honest scrutiny, the question of whether those two realities are connected is one that needs to be asked clearly and answered honestly rather than diplomatically deflected. Indiana's coaching staff sideline response to the elbow call in real time also deserves direct acknowledgement. The footage of the sideline reaction when the call was confirmed and then maintained through review shows assistant coaches encouraging calm rather than advocating forcefully for Cunningham or challenging the officiating decision with the urgency that the evidence of the play clearly warranted. When a player takes a clear elbow to the face and is then called for a defensive foul, the expectation from a coaching staff that genuinely has that player's back is a visible and vocal advocacy response that communicates to the officiating crew, to the opposing team, and most importantly to the player herself that the organization will protect her when she is demonstrably wronged on the floor. The footage suggests that response was not delivered with the energy this specific situation demanded. This connects directly to the broader question Indiana fans have been raising throughout this season about this franchise's willingness to protect its players when officiating decisions cross the line from judgment calls into something that looks increasingly like systematic targeting. The precedent established this season with Caitlin Clark, the documented pattern of physical plays that went uncalled, the inadequate disciplinary responses from the league, the congressional attention that became necessary to generate any meaningful institutional acknowledgement, all of that exists as immediate and unavoidable context for how Indiana should be responding when Cunningham receives the officiating treatment she received against Minnesota. Now let us address the other physical plays from this game that deserve specific analytical attention beyond the Cunningham elbow call, because there were multiple situations that the footage documents clearly. Contact with Kelsey Mitchell's face occurred during this game. The footage of that contact and Mitchell's reaction are circulating alongside the Cunningham footage and generating their own discussion. The most relevant analytical question about Mitchell's reaction is one that the footage and Mitchell's established competitive reputation answered directly and completely. Kelsey Mitchell does not flop. She does not embellish contact. She does not manufacture reactions to influence officiating decisions. Anyone who has watched Mitchell compete throughout her professional career understands that these characteristics are simply not part of her competitive profile. She absorbs contact and she competes through it. That is who she is as a player. When Mitchell reacted the way the footage shows her reacting to the contact in this game, that reaction reflects actual impact from actual contact rather than any strategic performance designed to draw a call she did not genuinely earn. The separate play involving Caitlin Clark during a drive sequence is the one requiring some analytical nuance. Observers examining the footage carefully are working through whether the contact was purely incidental, whether it reflected an unconventional movement pattern at an unfortunate moment, or whether it represented something else. The honest analytical position on that specific play is that regardless of how the intent question resolves, the result created genuine physical risk for Clark at a moment when her feet left the floor, and the timing of the contact in relation to her airborne position made the play problematic from a player's safety standpoint, whether or not the intent to create that specific outcome was present. What is not analytically ambiguous across any of these situations is that Indiana players are consistently on the receiving end of physical contact and officiating outcomes that do not reflect standards being applied consistently across comparable plays involving other players and other franchises throughout this league. That pattern is documented. It is visible in footage that is accessible to anyone willing to look at it honestly. It is generating commentary from sports media voices with no particular investment in the WNBA's internal institutional politics, who watch the footage and arrive at the same conclusions that dedicated league observers and Indiana fans have been reaching throughout this entire season. The Cheryl Reeves situation regarding the shirt she wore to the game has generated its own significant commentary and is developing into a separate story that extends beyond the basketball itself. Reeves has gone on record publicly explaining the reasoning behind wearing that specific shirt to a professional basketball game in her role as head coach of a professional organization. Whatever assessment individual observers arrive at regarding those stated reasons, the decision has generated conversation that the Minnesota Lynx organization is now navigating in the public discourse. There is a reasonable observation to be made about the consistency with which institutional consequences follow similar conduct across different people and different organizations within this league's environment, and that observation is being made loudly by the portion of the audience paying close attention to how these situations are handled or not handled. What needs to be stated with complete clarity is that the officiating situation surrounding Sophie Cunningham is not going to resolve itself through the passage of time or the eventual distraction of other news cycles. The footage exists in permanent form. The pattern is visible across multiple games now. The mainstream sports media commentary about the specific elbow call from the Minnesota game reflects a broader community of observers that is paying close enough attention to recognize when officiating outcomes do not match the evidence that cameras captured and replay systems confirmed. The Indiana Fever organization needs to be considerably more aggressive in advocating for Cunningham when these calls occur in real time. The coaching staff needs to be visibly and vocally present in those moments, rather than managing the situation with the measured restraint that was visible in the sideline footage from this specific game. There is a meaningful difference between maintaining professional composure and failing to advocate for a player who has just been assessed a foul for receiving an elbow to her face. The former is reasonable and appropriate. The latter is an organizational failure that compounds the officiating failure rather than challenging it. The league's officiating department needs to examine the specific pattern of calls involving Cunningham with the same rigor that any documented pattern of questionable officiating decisions should receive from an institution that is serious about applying its own stated standards consistently and without regard for which players or which organizations are involved in any given situation. If the officiating treatment Cunningham is receiving is in any way connected to her public positions and represents an institutional cultural response to those positions, that is a serious problem requiring immediate and serious institutional accountability. If it is not connected to those positions and represents instead a cluster of individual officiating failures that happen to concentrate around one specific player, that is equally a serious problem requiring equally serious institutional accountability. The accountability is owed in either scenario. The footage makes that clear beyond reasonable dispute. And the accumulating pattern of similar situations involving Indiana players throughout this season makes that accountability obligation more urgent, not less urgent, with each new documented incident. Sophie Cunningham took an elbow to the face. Officials reviewed the play. The foul was called on Cunningham. That is the documented reality of what happened in the Indiana-Minnesota game. The institutional response to that documented reality from the league, from the coaching staff, and from the organization responsible for protecting its players needs to be considerably more robust than what the footage from the sidelines suggested it was at the moment it mattered most. The footage exists permanently. The calls were made and confirmed. None of it holds up under honest application of the rules this league is supposed to enforce equally across all games and all players. That is what demands attention. That is what demands direct institutional response. And that is what the evidence of this specific game, placed in the full context of everything this season has already produced, makes impossible to responsibly defer any longer.